Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to, I guess, our second to last lecture in our class on witchcraft and the occult. So today, as you can see, I'm in a different room as usual. I'm back at my home department, but I'm in some student lounge. So I hope if anybody bursts in, I kind of close the door, kind of wedged it closed. So hopefully we won't be interrupted. If we do, I'll just stop recording and do a part two to this down the road. But anyway, so today we're going to look at modern witchcraft, sort of modern neo-paganism, and how that ties into notions of women, gender, and things to that effect. Okay, so if you would jump to the first slide, I kind of want to backtrack a tiny bit and talk a little bit about, well, the Burning Times video. While nominally that video was actually about medieval witchcraft, in a lot of ways it was really about the modern interpretation of witchcraft origins, of how modern Wiccans, I should say, interpret their own mythology and how they understand this idea of witchcraft in history. And Reed is actually, I think in a lot of ways, putting that kind of argument forward. So anyway, Reed, the director of the film, had a couple of points she was trying to make when she was making her movie. First, she claimed that the witch hunts happened for two apparent reasons. One, it was an attack on paganism, on this notion of ancient pre-Christian religion that existed before the Roman Empire. And because paganism focused on the feminine powers of goddesses, earth, nature, and what have you, women became the primary target, and that makes a certain sense if you go by that logic. Also, she claimed that the witch hunts during the Burning Times were an attack against women in general, and this was also due to ideas of misogyny, that women were considered less than men, and therefore the church wanted to exert their authority. Okay, so this is sort of the basic premise that was going on with her understanding. Now, I also went over last time that there is some problems with this argument. Not that it is possibly couldn't be accurate. It's just that the evidence certainly doesn't hold up to that kind of scrutiny. So, for instance, a lot of scholars, a lot of academics, historians take a very different approach to this this claim based upon sort of the evidence that is available. So, for instance, her claim that 9 million people were killed, again, I pointed out that that is simply not the case, or at least the evidence does not back that up in any way, shape, or form. I discussed that it was closer to about 100,000 people or so. I also went into a lot of detail of things like the social change theories, the economic upheaval, confessional states, the idea that Protestants and Catholics were duking it out, and so a lot of people who were victimized in the witch hunts could have been swept up in that kind of thing. So Reed sort of ignores that, or at least doesn't really mention it. And also, I should also point out that scholars note that there's very little evidence that the folks who were engaged in witchcraft, or who were accused, I should say, of engaging in witchcraft, actually were engaging in things like paganism, ancient religious practice, any of this sort of pre-Christian understanding that Reed was trying to put forward. And again, folks do recognize that women were definitely targeted. The numbers certainly don't lie. But the idea that this was perhaps simply an issue of misogyny doesn't really hold a lot of water, or at least it doesn't answer all the questions. In particular, why some men were accused of witchcraft. And that's something that we need to consider. And also, again, I should backtrack a bit, the idea that midwives, for instance, were targeted. Again, the evidence kind of points out that, and that's not necessarily the case, and at times midwives were compliant, or at least helped out with the persecution. So again, Reed's understanding is one that perhaps skews some of the historical evidence that we have available to us. Now, if you would jump to slide 3. So I also mentioned before the film that one of the questions that comes up in the witch hunts is, of course, whether or not this stuff actually happened, or not actually happened, that this idea of paganism was something that was in play during this time. Reed seems to want to make the case that that is definitely what was happening, but she doesn't necessarily make the case because it, is based upon the evidence per se. In a lot of ways, she is making the case that it is based upon this pre or non-Christian traditions, because she is intentionally drawing connections between what happened during the witch hunts, but also, and the folks who were persecuted, but also modern practitioners, contemporary folks nowadays who are can consider themselves witches. She is drawing a level of pedigree from those folks back then. Were doing the same sort of stuff that we, as modern pagans, are doing now. And also, she assumes that these sort of contemporary witches have something in common with sort of other alternative non-Christian practices. She talks about the folk healers of Mexico and Peru. So this idea that she is making these links, she is drawing, ancient witchcraft, the stuff from the Middle Ages, modern witchcraft, and sort of other non-Christian practices, for Reed anyway, are being all tied together. So this sort of witchcraft, paganism, what have you, focuses on this kind of universal, this idea that witchcraft shares, certain pagan roots. It does have emphasis on healing, and also on women's power, women's understanding of how or not women's understanding, sorry, women's sort of centrality in sort of non-Christian traditions, okay? Now, if you would jump to slide 5. So I do want to go into a bit more detail about this, what essentially is the disjuncture between what is, what a historian, somebody like myself, would think about, and how a modern Wiccan or somebody like Starhawk might think about that, and kind of discuss not sort of, well, that one's right and that one's wrong, but how academics try to account for this disconnect that, our evidence doesn't necessarily support what the devotee, the believer, happens to think. And whether or not that's a problem. I always say I'm in religious studies. If it was down to facts, I'd have nothing to talk about. So I kind of want to talk about that element a little bit. So anyway, here's a pretty common narrative when it comes to what is sort of understood as witchcraft. This is something that was implicit in the video. This is an explicit quote from one of your readings, Lerdman, and the quote goes, "Witchcraft is a religion that dates back to Paleolithic times, to the worship of the god of the hunt and the goddess of fertility. One can see remnants of it in cave paintings and in the figurines of goddesses that are many thousands of years old. This early religion was universal. The names changed from place to place, but the basic deities were the same. Now, when Christianity came to Europe, its inroads were slow. Kings and nobles were converted first, but many folk continued to worship in both religions. Dwellers in the rural areas, the pagans and the heathens, kept to the old ways. Churches were built on sacred sites of the old religion. The names of the festivals were changed, but the dates were kept. The old rites continued in folk festivals, and for many centuries, Christian policy was one of slow co-optation. Now, during the times of the persecution, the church took the god of the old religion and, as is the habit of the conquerors, turned him into the Christian devil. The old religion was forced underground, its only record set forth in distorted form by its enemies. Small families kept the religion alive, and in 1951, after the witchcraft laws of England were repealed, it began to surface again. Okay? So this is a pretty similar narrative that we had in Reed's film. This is something that we should be somewhat familiar with. Now we have this idea that there's this old pagan religion, worship a goddess that was suppressed by the elite forces of Christianity, that these forces reinterpreted this stuff as devil worship and this idea of othering that is going on, and the witch hunts were an attempt to wipe it out. But somehow these practices remained there, that they were hidden, that they went underground, and only after laws against witchcraft, which apparently were repealed in England in 47. Actually, the witchcraft laws in Canada were finally struck down December of 2018, which strikes me as utterly absurd. But anyway, somehow after this practice stayed relevant, or stayed going on hidden underground, when the witchcraft laws were repealed, essentially it could come out of the shadows and be, part and parcel of the world. Now, like I discussed before, historians are pretty iffy when it comes to this kind of narrative. Again, there simply is no evidence to back that up. Now, that isn't to say that this is an outright lie, of course. Don't worry, it's not booze. Well, I wish it was. Anyway, it's not simply an outright lie. It's just that we don't have any evidence to kind of back that up. But for people within Wiccan communities, that doesn't necessarily matter to the same extent. And I should point out that Wiccans themselves disagree with whether or not this narrative is accurate. Some think, yeah, it's sort of the gospel truth. Others think that, no, that's sort of a fictive account that has no bearing on their own tradition. So what I want to do is kind of try to make sense of both the disconnect between what some Wiccans and historians think and how some Wiccans amongst themselves disagree with how this narrative plays into their ideas. Now, if you jump to slide 5, there are two essentially general approaches to this problem. Some point out that the Burning Times narrative doesn't meet some sort of criteria that they have that would back up this claim, that it's not historical, it doesn't follow the facts in some way, shape, or form. And I have to be honest, that is boring as crap. I mean, as I said, I study early Christianity. If it was based upon the facts, I'd have nothing to look at, okay? And again, that's just not intellectually or academically satisfying. Again, I can say with pretty good certainty that there's very little, if any, evidence for the historical Jesus, that there probably, at least I can't see any evidence of this dude running around doing stuff. Does that mean that I should dismiss all the accounts about this figure, or do I try to account for them in some way, shape, or form? Now, probably a more fruitful way of approaching this, has a little more nuance, is that kind of taking seriously the claims that these folks are making, but looking at the rhetorical traction that a lot of people might have in maintaining these stories. So again, we can still agree that a lot of the historical information we have access to would challenge this overall narrative. But something to consider is, why is it that people want to maintain this kind of understanding? Again, we clearly can say that probably nobody has come back from the dead, historically, academically, scientifically, however you want to frame it. Yet Christians do buy into this, without me saying, oh, that's just crap, and why would you believe such a stupid thing? I want to look at what sort of rhetorical traction, what is it about that story, that myth, that people find appealing? What does it say about their community? And that's the way I want to approach something like modern witchcraft, as a myth. And myth usually has this negative connotation, that somehow secondary, derivative, something to that effect. This is definitely not the way we are looking at it in this context. So I want to talk about a scholar named Bruce Lincoln. I believe I gave you that reading. He approaches myth in a really interesting kind of way, and that's how I want us to think about these narratives, not so much whether they're true or not, i.e., should be dismissed or not, but whether, what is it about these stories, these narratives that appeal to people, okay? So if you would jump to slide 6. So for Bruce Lincoln then, he would claim that in popular usage, the term myth, so, as we're chatting with our buddies or something, it tends to be applied to things that do not fit certain levels of historic criteria. Like, that's stupid. That's just a myth, right? It's usually seen as something dismissive. Now, he breaks it down into some pretty good sort of point-by-point elements. He claims that if something doesn't fit within all three of the criteria he noted, most people would, claim it's a myth. So, for instance, if an event is not fixed within a fixed position of time. So, for instance, way back in antiquity, once upon a time, right? We don't know what that means. So probably most people would say, well, then it's probably a myth, as opposed to something like the War of 1812, which took place, weirdly enough, in 1812. So again, if we can't affix a date to something, most people would think of it as a myth. Also, if there were reputable written sources about an event, so eyewitness accounts, legal documents, these kinds of things, if we don't have those, most people would say, yeah, it's probably a myth. And also, the only significant actors are humans, so there's not gods, ghosts, spirits, these kinds of things. So according to Bruce Lincoln, most people, if they can think of a story, a narrative, as not missing out on all of these things, we would normally call it history. But if it doesn't have a fixed date, it has ghosts and goblins, there isn't historical records, most people then would dismiss it as being mythic in some way, shape, or form. Now, Lincoln has a serious problem with this understanding. So that argument that that sort of list of 3 points, he is actually offering a critique. And to be perfectly frank, I agree with him. He is one of the smarter people in the world, so I kind of tend to go along with what he says. Mainly because when people use criteria to call something a myth, they are implying that those who consider it authoritative, important, are somehow ignorant or stupid or somehow less informed than other people. It's something that a figure Richard Dawkins always does. I mean, he's a terrible scholar when it comes to the notion of religion. He just dismisses, well, I'm going to say a scholar, he's simply a grumpy old polemic. He dismisses stuff as myth and therefore not worth investigating. And to be perfectly frank, that's not true. I mean, a lot of people who are very intelligent, for instance, hold to the myth of the resurrection. I don't, but it's pretty damn arrogant for me to think that they are stupid in some way, shape, or form, because I don't happen to agree with them. And again, when it comes to the Burning Times myth, and I use this in the Bruce Lincoln sense, most people who hold to it are pretty damn educated. Most Wiccans are college or university educated. These are not bumpkins or simple folk. So if you think about it, it's pretty damn condescending to assume that if somebody doesn't hold to an understanding that you have, that perhaps they are the problem, that they are ignorant in some way, shape, or form. Now, as a scholar, I don't have to accept their claims. I clearly am not going to accept that a resurrection really happened, that Muhammad really flew, that the Burning Times actually was a suppression of ancient paganism, but that doesn't require me to think I am smarter. It requires me to ask different questions and to approach the material in a different way. So Bruce Lincoln, again, who is smarter than most people, argues that this distinction, this idea that, if it's a myth, it's stupid, needs to be put aside. In particular with scholars, we shouldn't be perpetuating these things. And he says that narratives like the Burning Times, like the resurrection, all these kinds of things need to be classified not on their content, whether we have dates, gods, what have you, but on the claims made by the narration and what communities do with such information. Okay, so it's not what the story says that is irrelevant. He's looking at it, what does the story claim to say or do, and what do people do with that information? That, to him, is the central feature of how we should analyze these things. So I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. Okay. Now, if you go to slide 8, Bruce Lincoln says, in some narratives, neither the narrator nor the audience claims that the story is true, or any truth claims are being made, and so he would call that a fable. So, for instance, the story where you prince, where you kiss a frog, and it turns into a prince or a princess. Unless you're 6 years old, you probably don't believe it. And the story itself is not making the claim that it is true either. It is a different kind of narrative. So in Bruce Lincoln's understanding, if the narrator or the source doesn't claim to be true, and the audience doesn't accept it as true, then we should think about these things as fables. If you jump to slide 9. Now, in other narratives, the narrator claims to be retelling, of course, a true event, but the audience does not accept that as being true or credible, and he would call those legends. So, for instance, stories about King Arthur, they claim to be discussing events that actually happened, but most folks, when they hear this stuff, and I say most because some people do believe it, see it as fiction in some way, shape, or form. So the narrator's making claims to truth, but nobody necessarily accepts it as true, or the community. So in Bruce Lincoln's understanding, this would be legend. If you jump to slide 10, now narratives in which the narrator claims to be presenting truth claims and the audience accepts it could be considered either history or myth, according to Bruce Lincoln. Now, this sort of credibility or authority or what have you is not necessarily based on facts, whether something is true or false or what have you. For Bruce Lincoln, the facts really don't matter. His concern is whether a group accepts the narrative as true by whatever criteria they happen to think is relevant, but also what they do with this claim. What is it about this story that makes it unique or special? Okay? So if you jump to slide 11, so what he claims is that if something claims to be true, it is taken to be credibly true by the group around them, but it doesn't really do anything for the community, then that would be considered history. Now, stories that make truth claims are considered credible, but also are authoritative, are considered to be myth. Okay, this is something that's really important that I want you to be aware of. Usually history and myth, history is what's on top, myth tends to be on the bottom. Lincoln's kind of inverting that. He's pointing out that myth actually is more relevant in some way, in a lot of ways, that it says more about the community that holds to it. So he goes on to say, myths don't just claim to reproduce some true event. The event depicted plays a role in how the social group would actually define itself. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples that would make that I hope will make some sense. So if you jump to slide 12, the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War, the whole narrative around it. In Bruce Lincoln's model, this would be considered a myth. Now, of course, it has a date, it has written records. We clearly have no supernatural participants or anything about that. That really doesn't matter. But the narrative claims, the narrative makes certain truth claims, and for a lot of Americans, a lot of folks in the United States, this narrative plays a role in sort of their national identity, that it tells them something of what it means to be an American, right? So for instance, this story, I'm a Canadian. This story for me is history. Clearly it happened. There's dates and records, no gods, what have you, but it doesn't say anything to me. I don't care in a lot of ways. The American Revolution doesn't impact my community, doesn't impact my notion of self-identity. But somebody who might be a Tea Partier, for instance, who wear the tricorner hats, the American Revolution means something. It is mythic in its understanding of what it is to be an American. Now, if you would jump to slide 13, Here's something, another way we can look at it. Think of the construction of the Panama Canal. Bruce Lincoln would say it is history. Now we have dates, we have written accounts, no supernatural actors. So in a lot of ways, it hits all the same buttons as the American Revolution, but it doesn't really sing to the American identity. It doesn't go like when somebody says that they're an American, they're usually not thinking, at least I'm assuming, that yeah, we're those people who built that really kick-ass canal, right? The revolution, for instance, might appeal more to a sense of identity, where the canal simply does not. Now, if you jump to slide 14, the Jesus narrative, the one that we find in the New Testament, this is clearly a myth, like Bruce Lincoln would say. The texts we have, like the Gospels, make a bunch of truth claims, but they are of questionable historical credibility. The earliest text we have was written 4 or 5 years after Jesus' apparent death, and it would have been the Apostle Paul talking to a ghost. All the other Gospels that we have in the New Testament are at least 30 to 100 years after his supposed death. So again, you know, they're not reliable sources. We have a bunch of supernatural entities going on, yet nonetheless, because even though it doesn't fit all those boxes, because it does shape how some Christians think about themselves as Christians, shapes their identity, you know, what would Jesus do? We should think of these stories as myth, okay? So put them on the same level as something like the American Revolution. Now, if you jump to slide 15, now if you think about stories about the god Zeus, right? These, in Bruce Lincoln's mind, would be considered legends or perhaps even fables. Now, in the past, people may have taken them seriously. People may have thought of them as being credible, mythic, and that they would say something about the community. But nowadays, people don't usually think about the god Zeus as an authoritative figure, as somebody or something that, you know, sings to one's identity. There's very little, I would say, evidence that there's any, you know, contemporary social group who draws identity from this figure. So even though the stories in a lot of ways are very similar to, say, what Jesus would have, or at least not necessarily similar in content, but similar in evidence, right? That they are, you know, late, that they, you know, they clearly involve gods and what have you. That doesn't mean that we should, you know, think about them on the same level, simply because there is no community dedicated to Zeus, where there is a community dedicated to Jesus, or communities, okay? And this brings us, of course, to the Burning Times. That whole movie that we saw, yeah, there was a lot of plot holes. There's a lot of historical problems going on there, but we should think about this narrative as myth. It makes truth claims, and some actually accept it to be credible, to be true in some way, shape, or form. So I don't necessarily have to accept it. You don't necessarily have to accept it, but Wiccans do, and as such, we should take that seriously. It is important to note that it is a narrative that is authoritative for these communities, and as such, we should think about, why is it authoritative? What's going on with this story that makes it central to these people's ideology? Okay, I hope that makes sense. Let's jump to slide 17. This essentially is where we get into the nitty-gritty of our material. This brings up one of our readings, Luerdman. She is a professor at the university, or Stanford University, and her book she wrote in 1989, Persuasions of a Witch's Craft, did this really interesting thing where she interviews a variety of folks who are Wiccan, and she came to the conclusion that some folks found the story of the Burning Times authoritative. They saw it as accurate, that it did something for them, where other Wiccans didn't see it as being all that authoritative, that it somehow was seen as, well, it'd be seen as history, legend, but not myth. And she wants to kind of figure out what is going on, okay? So that's something that we should definitely consider. So in the Lerdman reading, then, she does not usually, or she doesn't talk about stories as being mythic or historic. I think the term she uses is evocative pull. So this idea that there's something about the story that evokes certain emotion, and that's something that I want us to keep in mind. Okay, so there is something in the story that makes a certain sense, that people somehow are drawn to it. Again, story of the American Revolution. Why is it that Americans, for instance, are drawn to it, or somebody like me, who's a Canadian, is not? Okay, what is the evocative pull for an American versus a Canadian? An example I would have is that the War of 1812. This is in Canada, at least especially where I grew up, a war in which the American aggressors, the folks from the South, tried to take our country from us, and we fought them off. We being Canadians. Now, of course, this is before there was Canada, but the idea is that mythically this makes sense. It's a way of identifying or self-identification. A lot of Canadians take this as gospel truth. Doesn't mean that the facts weren't there, that that's not what happened. But the resonance, the evocative pull, is something certainly to consider. Okay, so if you would jump to slide 19, sorry. This is sort of just a statement that Bruce Lincoln makes regarding understanding other groups and trying to understand what it is that they are talking about. And this is a thing that we need to consider, especially in religious studies. And he says scholars should not be condescending about myths, of course, but of course we shouldn't necessarily take them at face value. So for instance, I shouldn't be condescending towards the idea of, say, Jesus coming back from the dead or the burning times myth. That doesn't mean we have to be condescending about it, okay? That we shouldn't be complete and utter jerks when it comes to discussing these kinds of things, okay? All right, that's enough of the theory kind of element. Let us then jump into the burning times myth and what this may or may not represent. Now, one argument, and again, if you would jump to slide 20, one argument that is quite common in scholarship relates to the broader context in which most contemporary witch communities happen to exist. These are in Western-centric cultures, North America, Europe, in which Christianity has been the dominant tradition essentially for the whole time. So that's something I want you guys to consider when we're going into this. Somebody just snuck in, but they got scared and they left. I totally scared them. Anyway, so one argument is that we have to consider the context in which this stuff happens to be operating under. So witchcraft, modern witchcraft, is a product or is rooted in European, North American society, where Christianity is still dominant. But a lot of folks have made the claim that this sort of burning times myth is sort of a retelling of kind of the discrimination that a lot of Wiccans faced, especially at the beginning of the tradition's development. Now, historically, or I should say mythically, like Donna Reed says, witchcraft goes back thousands upon thousands of years. Historically, we can only say that this actually started in the 1940s. Contemporary witchcraft has a definitive beginning during the 1940s, and of course there was a lot of resistance to it. People were quite dismissive of it or had suspicions about it. Folks thought it was satanic, and people actually lost jobs, lost children because they claimed to be witches. There was a lot of essentially, persecution of these folks. And the idea is that perhaps the burning times myth, that story that we saw in the video, would reflect that kind of discrimination that these people would have experienced. It places their discrimination not as a a new religion being picked on, but as a long history of their tradition always being suppressed, always being considered problematic in some way, shape, or form. So that's something I want us to consider when we are looking at this evidence. That just because the story itself doesn't necessarily fit all those boxes that Bruce Lincoln is talking about, nonetheless, we have to consider the mythic implications of these things. Okay? All right. I will leave it there for now, and we will get back to this later on in the week. All right. Take care.